Well, this afternoon's session is going to be presented by Colonel Thomas Dempsey, retired. And the objectives of this session is to discuss how security sector reform is needed by the paradigm shift to a more development-based and people-focused concept of security. To discuss how security sector reform could assist countries in Africa to better address new emerging security threats, to define the actors and goals associated with security sector reform, and to determine what this means for African militaries and police forces in particular, and for the broad security sector in general. The last objective is to explore the processes and methodologies required for successful security sector reform. Colonel Dempsey is a U.S. Army retired colonel, and he is the Africa Center for Strategic Studies Chair for Security Studies. Professor Dempsey specializes in security sector reform, rule of law, post-conflict transitions, and peace operations. He served as the Professor of Security Sector Reform with the U.S. Army Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, from 2007 up to 2009. Professor Dempsey joined the Peace and Stability Operations Institute after returning from 8 months in Monrovia, Liberia, where he directed the reconstitution and training of the Liberian Ministry of National Defense as part of the joint U.S.-Liberian Security Sector Reform Program. Colonel Dempsey served as Director of African Studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College from 1999 through his retirement in August 2006. His 31-year military career as an infantry officer and African Foreign Area officer included service as the Chief of Africa Branch at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, Human Services, and as Defense Attaché in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Professor Dempsey edited and was a contributing author to Civil Power in Irregular Conflict 2010. He authored a monograph entitled Counterterrorism in African Failed States 2006, and has published articles in Bresse's Defense Analysis. And Professor Dempsey has a BA in History from Wichita State University, an MA in African Area Studies from University of California, Los Angeles, and an MAS in Theater Operations from the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He is currently a doctoral candidate in public administration at Penn State, Harrisburg. Put your hands together, join me to welcome Colonel Dempsey to the podium.
I feel a little bit like the parish priest who comes in Sunday morning to say morning mass, only to find that he has been paid a visit by the Pope and several of the Pope's cardinals who want to hear a lecture on Catholic theology. It's clear to me from the past several days, from both within my discussion group and your comments in plenary, that there are a lot of people here who know much more about security sector reform than I do, and who are involved in some of the most challenging and innovative security sector reform programs ongoing today. And make no mistake about it, Africa is the center of gravity for security sector reform. It has already outpaced Europe and the United States and other regions of the world in tackling difficult challenges of reforming African security sectors, in learning tough lessons in what works, what doesn't work. And I have to tell you, to the extent that we are going to solve the really tough challenges of SSR as a community of practice together, you're where those solutions are going to come from. And I have already learned more in the past 3 days from listening to the comments here and in particular in my discussion group than at any other ACSS event I've been involved in. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the next 2 weeks. And I want to say a special hello to my colleagues from Liberia, to Hawa from my discussion group. Cecilia, where are you? To Cecilia, my colleague from the Ministry of National Defense in Liberia. And hopefully we will hear your voice in the coming hour and a half. I want to start by talking about where I think the SSR community of practice is. How are we doing? What are we doing well? What are we doing not so well? And I should say up front, I'm probably going to say some pretty controversial things. I'm just speaking for myself. These are my views. They're not the views of the Africa Center. They're certainly not the views of the U.S. government, so take them for what they're worth. The next slide's not particularly good. It's hard to read, but I'm just going to use it to refer to. This is kind of where I think SSR is. There are some things that we're doing very well. And probably at the top of this is the train and equip mission for our combat forces. We know how to do that. African militaries know how to fight. They're very good at it. They've demonstrated that over and over again on the continent and elsewhere. And where they haven't done well, it's typically not because they don't know how to fight. So that's an area that we're already pretty good at. I also think the community of practice is pretty good at addressing reform of civil-military relations, addressing a better relationship between African militaries and the societies that they serve. I think this is an ongoing process. It's a function of professionalization. Let me ask those of you who are military, how many of you have your own military staff college that trains your officers at the staff level? Raise your hands. Come on, I know there are more out there. How many of you have your own war colleges or defense colleges? Wow, even more. You know, if I'd asked this question 15, 20 years ago, there probably wouldn't be but 1 or 2 hands in the entire room. The professionalization of African militaries is one of the most fast-moving processes in the security sector reform community of practice. You are reforming yourselves. Your officer corps, your NCO corps are better educated, better trained, better prepared for the difficult missions that they're going to be asked to undertake. You yourselves are an example of this. The quality of the discourse is a tribute to the degree to which African militaries have transformed themselves. I believe part of that process as well is African involvement in peacekeeping and peace operations missions. In some of the most difficult missions that the international community and the African Union has confronted. Missions where your principal role is to preserve civilian life, to support political transitions, to support peace processes. I believe that is fundamentally transforming not simply African militaries. I think it's transforming the profession of arms. It's transforming what soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are all about. And it's transforming it for everybody. Africa just happens to be leading the rest of the world in this area. So those are 2 areas that I think the community of practice is doing pretty well in. An area where it's not doing as well is oversight of the military and the armed forces. I give executive branch oversight of the military as C+. Okay, that's pretty good. Fewer coups, the example of General Odillo, which we've already talked about in Malawi, and I think General Odillo is the rule, not the exception. That's a reflection of the changing culture in African militaries and African armed forces that accept civilian control of the military, that recognize the necessity for having apolitical, nonpartisan armed forces that do not involve themselves in the political process. Defense Ministry oversight, I don't give as good a grade to. And let me explain why that is. When you walk into the Ministry of Defense, and you see that there are 5 civilians, a defense minister, a deputy defense minister, 3 assistant ministers, and everybody else in the ministry is either a serving military officer or a recently retired military officer. You got to ask some hard questions about whether you've really got adequate oversight of the military. If the principal guys who are talking to the Minister of Defense about military issues are serving officers in uniform, who are answering to who? The minister, the Chief of Defense Forces, the Army Chief of Staff. One of the requirements of effective oversight in ministries of defense is a robust, competent, trained, and informed civilian workforce. Professional civil servants that can support the minister, the deputy minister, the other political appointees in performing their oversight duties. Now, I should add, obviously I'm generalizing. And when you look at Africa, you see a tremendous range in how the security sector is controlled and what oversight looks like in the state of civil-military relations. So I understand that I'm generalizing, and I'm certainly will take note for those of you who challenge me and say, no, that's not right, and this is why. Then I hope you will. Okay, now we get to the real problems. Problems where the community of practice is not doing well at all. And I'll start with legislative branch oversight. And we've talked about this a lot already. And legislative branch oversight is particularly important for a couple of different reasons. One reason is because the legislative branch plays such an important role in resource allocation and funding. And legislative committees across the continent are typically under-resourced, they lack expertise, they lack staff, they depend in a very real sense on you, on the security services themselves and members of the executive branch to inform them about these issues and offer technical expertise. And if you don't have a good relationship of trust with that executive branch, it's very, very difficult for them to perform that oversight function. There's another reason that legislative branch oversight is so important. And that's because in the legislative branch, typically everybody's represented, including opposition political parties. In most cases, executive branches are controlled by one party. And we all know about the problem of sort of winner-take-all politics. One of the advantages of going before an executive committee for a senior armed forces officer is that opposition parties have an opportunity to participate. They have an opportunity to ask questions. They have an opportunity to express their views about key issues that affect the security services and affect national security. One of the other reasons the legislative role is so important is because those legislators and parliamentarians are a key connection to the citizens that we all serve. We, as security professionals, have a vested interest in strengthening the legislative oversight role, being responsive to parliamentarians when they have questions, and helping them to do their job more effectively. That's not always easy to do, nor is it always a non-controversial undertaking, especially when the legislature, as is the case was the case in Liberia for most of the time I was there, the legislature is controlled by one party and the presidency is controlled by another. Now, I'm a senior uniformed officer. I work for the president. I work for the executive branch. But I also need to be responsive to the legislature when it wants me to come in and testify about what my service spent its money on and why my training hasn't gone forward. This can be a real challenge for us as senior uniformed leaders, but it's very, very important that we meet that challenge. Police and law enforcement reform. We get a really bad grade for this one, largely because we, the community of practice, aren't very good at it. We don't have a very good grasp of how to do it. This is the big we. If the Americans or the French or the British tell you they understand this stuff, we don't. Everybody's struggling with this one. And remember when I asked the question about who's got defense, defense colleges, who's got senior service colleges? Those of you who are military are much better educated, much better trained, much better prepared in almost every case than your colleagues on the police and civil law enforcement side. They don't have the benefits that you have had in professional development, in career development, in training and education. They have been grossly under-resourced for decades, going all the way back to independence and before. And we've talked about this. I've listened to the comments around the table about how problematic it is for me as a military guy when I'm supposed to partner with the police, and the police lack capacity. Remember I talked about civil-military relations, and we're doing pretty well, and I think we are? There's a counterpart to that. Civil-military relations is the relationship of the armed forces with society. What about the relationship of the police with society? What about the attitudes of the citizens towards those police? What's that look like? And my suggestion is that's really problematic. So police and law enforcement reform is something that really, really needs a focus. And as we've seen in our conversations, if the police part of the team lacks capacity or for whatever reason is not able to perform its appropriate role, that has significant implications for the armed forces and for the defense community. Okay, justice and rule of law reform. Now this is where it's going to get a little controversial. I'm just going to give you my assessment. Across the boards, justice and rule of law reform get an F, a failing grade. Even in countries where the justice and rule of law system works fairly well in the capital, and I'd argue there aren't a lot of them, what happens when you get out into the rural areas? When you get out to the border, when you get out into the remote mountains and rainforests in the Sahel, what's the justice system look like out there? One of the real challenges here is the justice system is absolutely critical to everything, and particularly to the police. Non-state actors and security sector reform. One of the features of Africa that distinguishes it from other areas of the world is the prevalence of non-state actors in the security sector. That's an area that the community of practice has not dealt with effectively, and it's one that I hope you'll spend some time talking about. Now, the last one's kind of interesting. Remember I said we know how to fight? We know how to train combat forces to do their missions? One of the challenges of security sector reform for African militaries is African militaries almost across the boards, with very, very few exceptions, are overstructured with combat forces and understructured with support, training, and administration. In other words, you got too many infantry battalions and tank battalions and artillery battalions and not enough of everything else. And it is not a small problem. It is a huge problem. It means when you deploy significant forces to the field, if you don't have somebody else to support them for you, they don't get paid, they don't get fed, they don't get their vehicles fixed, they don't get ammunition. This is what happened to the Malian army in the north. This is one of the real challenges for you as security sector leaders, because the solutions to this one are really tough. What are you going to do if you've got too much of a combat force and too little of a support force? Are you going to make your combat force smaller and your support force bigger? That's really hard to do and it's very costly. Are you going to make your whole army bigger so you can provide more support, training, and administration? That's also very costly. These are some of the critical issues for the community of practice. Okay. This one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I think you all know what the definition of security sector reform is. To kind of illustrate it, in the old days, before we cared about security sector reform, that was back during the Cold War when the Americans really only cared if your government supports us or supports the Soviets. And if they support us, all we care about is that you stay in power. If you support the Soviets, we kind of wish you weren't in power anymore. And so what do we care about as far as your security services are concerned? If you're our guy, hey, you keep your guy in power and we're happy because you're on our side. Well, that's needless to say, that's not the case anymore for the Americans or the French or the British. It might still be the case for the Chinese. I don't know. It depends on who you talk to. It hasn't been the case for you for a long time. There's kind of a myth out there that security sector reform began with the end of the Cold War. That's kind of like, well, political reform in Africa began with the end of the Cold War, which is a bunch of nonsense. Political reform and security sector reform in Africa has been going on a long time, since well before the end of the Cold War. I'm not even convinced that there's that much of a connection between the end of the Cold War and political liberalization on the continent or the reform of armies and police forces. I think that Africa was moving in that direction already, is continuing to move in that direction. And what does it mean in practical terms? In the old days, what we cared about was, does the policeman have his weapon? Is it clean? Is it serviceable? When he draws it and fires, does he hit what he's aiming at? That's what we cared about. Security sector reform says, I want to know why he drew the weapon in the first place. What exactly was he trying to do? What do the citizens think about him in the communities where he's patrolling? What does he think about them? How safe do those citizens feel? Is that policeman delivering the services that the citizen expects? Who controls him? Who does he work for? Those are the issues of security sector reform. Now, John Kelly and Dr. Punda talked for a long time about rule of law, and I'm glad they did. Justice and rule of law are the foundation of everything. That was the message yesterday. I have drunk the Kool-Aid. I believe that. And in security sector reform in particular, rule of law is the foundation that everything else rests on. When you look at the different pieces of the security sector, and it might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about what those pieces are. First of all, it's the guys with guns, okay? Everybody that delivers safety, whether you're armed forces, police, customs, Presidential Guard, investigative services, intelligence service. Those are the guys at the top. That's one part of it. The other part of it is everybody who's involved in managing and overseeing those bodies. Ministries of Defense, Ministries of Justice, Attorney General's Office of the President and the Prime Minister, legislatures, folks outside the government that help the government oversee how that security sector is operating. How many lawyers do we have? Raise your hand if you're an attorney or a judge. Oh, we have a few. Good. Organizations like professional organizations, bar associations, that help set standards, ethical values, frameworks for the profession as a whole. That's all part of management and oversight. And then, over here in this other one, there's civil society and non-state actors. And you'll see this in all the security sector literature, and it doesn't explain very well what it is, which is why hopefully you all have one of these. And I stole this. I stole it from Julie Warble, who is a longtime friend and colleague from the U.S. Agency for International Development. There's one up on the wall of my office. I encourage you to take this home and put it up on the wall of yours. It's the best reference I've ever found for how big the security sector is, for who all the stakeholders are, and how those stakeholders influence the process. These guys matter to us. And the three in the center are pretty straightforward. Armed forces, those are the guys with guns, armed forces, security forces. All those oversight and management bodies, those are all the politicians and their political appointees, right? We know about them. They're the ones, if you're in uniform, they're the ones who are supposed to be giving us orders. And all these guys in civil society. By the way, the most important one down here, Dempsey's personal opinion, a free and independent press that we as security professionals routinely talk to as part of the process of keeping our citizens informed about who we are, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. which can be kind of complicated sometimes because we also work for the elected political leaders and the political appointees. So you have to when you're a strategic leader, when you become the chief of defense forces, then you got the challenge of how you and the people who work for you deal with the press in the context of remaining responsive to the elected political officials and the appointed political leaders that you answer to. Then you finally got this group on there. This is a very important group. Non-state actors. Nice list here. Rebels, militias, gangs, criminal organizations, cartels, private security companies. Not necessarily all bad. Some of those non-state actors may be playing a critical role in providing security to our citizens. Some of them may not be. If you're undertaking security sector reform, you need to ask hard questions about who those non-state actors are, what kind of role they're playing, who controls them, who they are accountable to. I'll give a great example here. 1998, the Economic Community of West African States Ceasefire Monitoring Group, ECOMOG, crossed the border into Sierra Leone, overturned the illegal government of Johnny Paul Karoma, and restored the democratically elected government of Che John Kaba to power in Sierra Leone. They did it without any help from anybody. And if you hear different from the Americans or the Brits, I'm telling you, I was there. ECOWAS did it themselves. They didn't have help from anyone. Now, they went in with a pretty small package of combat forces. One of the only reasons they were able to be successful was because they partnered with groups like the Comajos, local militias that helped them find out where the Revolutionary United Front was, where Karoma's AFRC forces were. The challenge was, once those Comajos got outside their little area around their village, they became less and less effective and more of a liability. Once that little group of militias got outside of its area of Mende speakers and the clans that it all knew, and now it's a little farther north, it tended to look as everybody's a rebel. Everybody's the RUF. They had very little accountability. They were very difficult to control. And the longer ECOMOG worked with them, the bigger that problem became. And one of the things ECOMOG found out was, when the Comajos killed a bunch of civilians in a village, guess who got blamed? That's right. It was ECOMOG, because they're working for you. They're your guys. Non-state actors can be critically important in the security sector, but they also bring with them significant risks. And I encourage you to talk to your fellows from Niger who have experience with non-state actors in the north, in the Sahel, that I think is immensely valuable. The advantages and the disadvantages. Okay. Let's talk about some important developments in security sector reform as a whole. And probably the first and most important development is the movement from regime security to human security. From security services, police, military, customs, whose primary mission is keep the head guy in charge. Make sure the regime survives. And that's the old model, right? That's the way, well, that was certainly the colonial model. And once we had independence, unfortunately, it very quickly became the post-independence model. We rolled into the Cold War. It was a model the Americans and the Soviets were very comfortable with and very happy with. Yes, keep our guy in power. We like that. So you had kind of a common interest in framing security in state terms. You also had, what was the traditional security model? Clausewitz, warfare between nation states. That was the traditional way of thinking about security. The new way of thinking about security, which I honestly believe has its roots in Africa. Africa is leading the international community in reshaping how we think about security. Human security is not about regime survival. And it's not just about the state, although it is about the state a little bit, because you have to have a functioning state for citizens to be able to have the services and benefits they expect, and for them to be able to make their voice heard in a political sense. But human security is about citizen-based security. It's about the needs of the individual people and the communities that they live in. It's about more than just physical safety. It's about economic prosperity. It's about development. It's about healthcare. It's about education. All of these are part of a redefinition of security that says this is what the security sector is supposed to be delivering. And that is a definition that is growing much more rapidly in Africa and being adopted across the continent much more quickly than it's being adopted in the rest of the world. One of the things that I find particularly encouraging. Related to this is a growing understanding, and this is driven in large part by the nature of the threats to that new definition of security, whether it's drug dealing, illicit trafficking, cattle rustling, climate change, food security. There's a growing understanding that dealing with security issues is not something the military can undertake by itself, that it requires collaboration and partnership across the government. It requires the police, the military, customs, immigration, the justice system in particular, all working together. And in order to work together effectively, you have to have mechanisms that support collaboration and partnership. If your national security strategy or your national security policy, which lays out how you're supposed to deliver security to your citizens and to your state, if that's written almost exclusively by the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces, it's going to have a very, very limited scope. So how do you give the police a vote? How do you incorporate the other elements of the government that have a stake in security? How do you involve them in that discussion? And you see this developing very rapidly across the continent. Great example is Malawi, which is grappling right now with developing a process for crafting a national security strategy, for approving that strategy and figuring out how to implement it in an interagency sense with all of the elements of government involved. One of the leaders in this is the state, Liberia, which has created a human security strategy and has created nested within that, a national security strategy. This is an area where Africa, again, is leading the rest of the world. And one of the things that I fully expect is that many, if not most of you, will be directly involved in creating the strategies that will help your nations to realize the outcomes that security sector reform is intended to produce. One of the biggest challenges in this whole undertaking is finding the balance between the military and the police component of security sector reform and of providing security services. And why is that such a big challenge in Africa? Because Africa confronts challenges that span the military and policing realm. And we've talked about this a lot in our discussion group. I suspect you've talked about it in your discussions groups as well, where you have significant organized military threats. In other words, the way my Nigerian colleague used to explain it to me was, Colonel Dempsey, you really don't get it. When the cattle rustlers show up in Plateau State, there are several hundred of them, and they're carrying machine guns and mortars. And if I send my police out to arrest them, my police are just going to get killed. So we need to figure out how to deal with this and how to grapple with threats that have features of traditional military threats and also features of traditional criminal problems. We see this in West Africa in the growth of the drug trafficking and the appearance of criminal cartels that have the kind of resources that let them create, hire, organize militias that have real military capabilities. Partnership between the military and the police. And one of the risks here is if in the process of that partnership, the police stop being police and become infantry, or the military stops being military and tries to become police, then we have real challenges. Rule of law framework. I think I'll skip this one. Okay. Civil-military relations. Let's talk a little bit about what civil-military relations is all about. And I'm going to go through this very quickly, and then I'm going to wrap up. And this is something all of you understand from listening to the discussion over the last 4 days. It's something that you live and breathe every day. So we're just kind of reviewing something we all know. Obviously, we need a culture of respect for civil authority. Military officers advise civilian officials, hopefully elected or politically appointed civilian officials, decide. Now that means that those elected, appointed officials and the civil servants that serve them have to have the capacity, knowledge, ability to do that. An interesting observation here. Security sector reform is not a substitute for political reform. One of the challenges of SSR is if you try and proceed with security sector reform in environments which require political reform that has not been addressed, some of the discussions about political will are really talking about this. Security sector reform not only might not be successful, it can actually have a negative impact on things. If you're trying to build the capacity and abilities of security services that are inherently unaccountable, that operate with impunity, that violate rule of law, that are inherently corrupt because political reform hasn't gone forward, you can do more harm than good. This is a problem that's not unique to Africa, by the way. These are problems we have in the United States. Balancing accountability of military commanders to the executive and legislative branches. And I've talked about this previously. This is one of the biggest challenges you're going to confront. At some point in your career, most of you are going to have occasion to testify in front of Parliament or in front of the legislature. And they may ask you some tough questions about issues that are potentially embarrassing to the presidents or the prime ministers that you work for directly as part of the executive branch. And as a senior military leader, you are going to have to navigate those waters and try and navigate them in ways that preserve your role as a nonpartisan, apolitical professional, and at the same time preserve the principle of control of you and your service by elected and appointed political officials. It's sometimes very difficult to do. It's not something that is, it's something that has been challenging in the United States on more than one occasion, including fairly recently. Ensuring civilian control. How do you do that? How do you make sure that the elected and appointed political leaders actually control the levers of decision-making for the armed forces, the police, and the other security services? That's a really interesting question. And by the way, it's a very, very different question for your police counterparts than it is for those of us who are military officers. Because discretion is exercised at the top in the military. The military does what our chain of command orders us to do. And that chain of command does what the political leaders directs it to do. That is not how the police operate. Discretion in the police forces is exercised at the bottom. People don't tell it. The commander doesn't, or the police captain doesn't tell the policeman to go arrest that guy who just robbed the store. The policeman makes that decision based on his responsibility to enforce the law. And he's supposed to make it without being told to do it by anybody, and he's supposed to make it without interference from that political leadership. That's a very, very different model than the military model. And one of the challenges of security sector reform has developed as a military and defense-centric concept. And the police, law enforcement, and justice side has been kind of dragged into it. And one of the challenges is adapting security sector reform and adapting the models and practices that we created really for militaries and defense ministries to other sectors, of other pieces of the security sector. Okay. DDR. I'm going to speak briefly about disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, then I'm going to wrap up. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration is one of those critical areas of security sector reform that is particularly relevant and difficult in Africa. And if you remember General Manjate talking about the challenges of reintegrating 7,000, of integrating 7,000 Renamo soldiers into the Frelimo army. And why was that important? That's important because Renamo was from the north. And if you want the Northerners to ever look at those armed forces as being legitimate and as their armed forces, then those Northerners need to believe that they've got a stake in that institution. That's why the incorporation of the Renamo forces was so important. And it's a task that is incredibly challenging, especially where the main military is already existing. It's trained. It's got standards. It was educated. The officers have been to the Command and General Staff College. The NCOs have been to the NCO Academy. And now I'm trying to integrate a rebel force that doesn't have any of those attributes. This was the challenge that confronted the South Africans when they transitioned to black majority rule. And they at least had the benefit of having had some military education and training from their supporters during the struggle for black majority rule. Talk to the folks, talk to the Ethiopians about the challenges of a Bush army that had no training of that sort at all. I remember meeting one of my Ethiopian counterparts who had been a corps commander, who was a nurse before the war, had no formal military training at all. How do you incorporate these elements into a formal military in such a way that you preserve the integrity of your leadership, that you empower those entrants? Because if you don't empower them, they're never going to be regarded as a legitimate part of that military. These are some of the fundamental challenges that security sector reform is grappling with in Africa today. And on that note, I talked longer than I intended, and I apologize for that. So I will end there and look forward to your questions and comments.